Drow Shard Glacier is weird. Supposedly the spell creates a patch of high ground for Drow to attack from, and blocks movement and vision from the front. But the way it blocks movement is so janky. I mean, look at this. What is even blocking me? Today I'm going to investigate Glacier, figure out how it actually works, and by the end of the video, we're going to have an answer to why it blocked me. And I promise you, it's dumber than you think. I was really excited when Glacier got added to the game. I thought it heralded a solution to a modding problem that had plagued me for years. But unfortunately, the spell is emblematic of the very problem I was trying to solve. You see, in the past I had tried to make a custom game with dynamic map changes. I wanted to be able to hit a switch and completely overhaul the terrain. This would allow me to create games without having to worry about the maximum map size. Visually, this is actually quite easy. I can just toggle the world layer. But there's a problem. Even though the terrain looks different, it won't update the height of the terrain or its collision on a functional level. There is a partial solution to this. While I can't update the grid nav directly, I can spawn invisible objects that block pathing. If you've ever played a custom game with building mechanics, that's what they use. But I still can't get high ground to work. But I thought, maybe I can fake it. When a unit moves to a different height, it needs to be on top of the high ground visually and get all the high ground bonuses, like one-way vision and uphill mischance. I can kind of replicate that by giving a unit a buff that offsets their height if they stand on the high ground and manually determine mischance, but it looks terrible on ramps where your height needs to adjust gradually and your feet need to look to the ground. Vision is also tricky. I don't know of a good way to replicate height-based vision rules. Given these issues, I decided to scrap the concept. I could get like 80% of the way there, but the technology just wasn't there yet. So you can understand why I was excited about Glacier. If Valve had added a way to do dynamic high ground, suddenly my dynamic level generation became possible. It turns out, none of my problems had actually been solved. Valve had taken the same idea I had had and dismissed as being too janky and added it to the game. And not only that, their implementation was jankier than I had ever dreamed. Here's how Glacier works. First, it creates a particle that gives the implication of high ground. The icicles in front are there to indicate the area that is impassable. It then applies two buffs as an aura, one to any hero that stands on the hill, and the other to Drow exclusively. The generic buff adjusts the height of any unit that stands on the hill. There's no ramp, just 1 second you're on the ground and the next you're flying. It also gives ranged units bonus attack range and true strike, and a 25% mischance to enemies, which stacks with the normal uphill mischance, so if you're already uphill of an enemy, you now have a 44% mischance. So, they used True Strike and Evasion to try and replicate high ground advantage, but really they just made another separate system that overlaps with the existing one. Now the Drow exclusive buff. This buff does a number of things. First, it gives unrestricted flying vision, again to simulate how high ground vision works. However, there are usually layers to this. From a vision perspective, it's kind of like you're standing on an infinitely tall high ground. However, this is not the case for the vision blocking component. It will only block vision from enemies that are on the same level or one level up. If you go 2 levels up, you can see over it. That's cool. It also gives flying movement. This is necessary for you to be able to walk down the front of the hill. However, once you're off, you're no longer flying, and will have to walk around to get back on. Also, because you're flying, you can use Glacier to walk over walls. That's pretty useful. Finally, the buff also removes the range check for marksmanship. This isn't on the tooltip, and I think is just a straight up bug. You can see in the patch notes that this behavior was supposed to have been removed, but it's still there. Now we get to the really weird stuff. Let's talk about how pathfinding in Dota 2 works. Before the game begins, the map is divided into squares. Each square is designated as either pathable or impassable. This is what's known as the grid nav. In order to move from one square to another, you need to be able to trace a path along pathable squares horizontally or vertically. You can't move diagonally. I mentioned earlier that I can spawn objects that will block the grid nav. These are called point simple obstructions and will block a 2x2 square of tiles. This is what Glacier uses. But this represents a problem. You see, the Glacier is a circle, but the grid nav is made of squares. They're literally using square pegs to block a round hole.
And up next, a cylinder.
The circle.
I think that goes in
The circle.
the square hole.
To demonstrate this, I'm going to use a couple console commands. The first is CL Dota GridNav Show 1, and will show us the grid nav in-game. Pretty cool. You can use this to view juke paths. By tracing the green squares, you can see where the paths are. Let's try casting Glacier. In front of the hill are a bunch of 2x2 squares that block movement. Depending on the angle I cast the spell, the shape of the squares make changes as it tries to match the circle. A lot of the ground on the hill itself is blocked, which you don't normally notice because Drow isn't affected by it, but it is quite noticeable if you bring another hero onto the hill. But that's not all. Let's break out our second console command. Dota's Show Object Obstructions allows us to see things that temporarily block the grid nav, like trees, which appear as solid green squares. It also shows unit and building collision as blue circles. The size of the circle is dependent on the unit's hole radius. If a unit is big enough and standing in the middle of a grid nav tile, it can block other units from passing through. Let's cast Glacier again. You can see it created a bunch of those blue circles. In addition to changing the grid nav, Glacier is also creating invisible units with collision. This is really weird. Most of the circles aren't even touching the blocked grid nav area, and their placement seems almost random. It seems like there are 5 of them, some overlap with the blocked area, and some are just kind of near it. Also, they won't spawn in an area that's already blocked, so if I keep casting the ability, they'll spread out until my entire screen is covered in blue circles. Nobody can even get close to me. My best guess for what Valve was trying to do here was to create a rounded collision that more closely matched the shape of the hill, and tried to stack a bunch of circles to approximate that, with the grid nav blocks as a fallback. But I'm also guessing that they did not actually test this because holy shit. Remember our example from the start of the video? Here's what it looks like with the grid nav fog. The squares are blocking the top half of the lane, and there's a circle blocking the entire left. Also, because the grid nav hasn't been completely blocked, pathfinding is totally borked, and you get stuck walking into an invisible unit. This really sucks. These circle blockers contribute nothing to the spell. They just cause frustration. Valve needs to remove them. Now, I don't want to be too mean. I imagine what happened is someone came up with this cool idea for a shard that creates temporary high ground. Doesn't sound too crazy. But then some programmer had to actually figure out how to make that work. High ground vision is hard, so give flying vision. High ground evasion isn't dynamic, but we can fake it. Blocking the ground in front of you? Not possible to do with a circle, but we can probably hack something together. And they did. And honestly, I don't think most people really notice. On a basic level, this ability does close enough to what it says that people are satisfied. But not me. I hate this spell. But the only way we're going to get people to notice it is if we start abusing it. So, go. Abuse this shard. Torment your enemies. Harass your allies. Make them suffer. It's the only way.